Our Ben and Rook were about to leave to go after Maltruant, and Paradox appears, putting a time beast egg into the engine of the combined time cycles, telling them that they must hurry and stop Maltruant, and if they cannot stop him in the past, then the time beast egg will allow them to travel to places beyond even his reach, and wish them good luck, as he said he would make sure things went back to normal here. They teleported into the time stream and chased after Paradox as the villain launched missiles at them that they had to maneuver around before speeding up and slamming into Maltruant, as the time beast then began to vanish through the fabric of time. Rook says that they should be careful not to end up the same as the time beast, but Ben reminds them that they are shielded, as they then slammed Maltruant through it, going through themselves and skidding across the ground, tearing up a groove into the dirt as they did so. Rook says that they are now lost in time and that they had lost Maltruant, but Ben says that Paradox put him in charge for a reason. This isn't a democracy, and someone appeared pointing an old antique musket at them that appeared to be brand new. Ben recognizes the guy as George Washington, George saying that they have him at a disadvantage as they know his name but he does not know theirs. Rook puts his proto tool away, telling George that he is a visitor from among the stars. George says that their conveyance supports that claim, and Ben tells them that the two of them are from the future, seeking a villain that wishes to bring harm to countless lives. George tells them that, be that as it may, he has his own orders to carry out. He currently hunts a poor soul trapped in a death-like state, to which Ben calls a zombie. They tell them that it is their duty to keep his countrymen safe from things that go bump in the night. Rook says that sounds very similar to the original Earth Plumber Directive, Plumiers, French for ironworks, as the zombie appears, and Ben tells them he's got this one, changing into Ghost Freak and trying to control them, but since it didn't work, he instead used his tendrils to grab and hold them as George supplied an antidote to them, changing them back to human again. Since George didn't try to take the Redcoat prisoner or anything, he says that they must be at a time before the Revolutionary War has started, with Rook pointing out the position of the stars, and a ship appeared, as he says that the plumber records showed that the 1773 was the first documented recording of an alien craft, as Ben sort of recognized it but was still a bit different. The ship dropped down a large anchor with red orbs all over it, and Rook says that the plumber records did not specify what ship it was, but the records called it the Cherry Tree. George then volunteers to join the two of them on their mission now that he has completed his task. Ben asks Rook to make sure the time cycles were okay and bring them over if they were in working order, while he and George went to check on what's going on. Nodding, Rook stayed behind while Ben and George went to investigate. They see Maltruant and find a young Vilgax there. As they duck down, Ben tells George that these are two of his toughest opponents he'd ever faced in combat, though George says that he has not seen anything that proved as such, and Ben took off his shirt, showing him all kinds of scars that he'd gotten from battle, but pointed out one of them was from Maltruant that looked like a seriously bad burn, and then showing him a large claw-like scar that had been scratched over smaller scars, telling them that the big one was from Vilgax before putting his shirt back on. George then asks what it is they should do, and Ben tells him to take down the little guys while he handled Vilgax and Maltruant. Nodding, they then began fighting and the smaller robots who had blasted at them the moment he stood up, showing that they were not there as friends, just as Ben had warned them that they weren't. Ben changed into depth charged and used the water in the river to fight Vilgax while Maltruant was getting his chariot fixed, and kept blasting at him but was knocked back, and so he hit the Omnitrix symbol, changing into Astrodactyl, and continued fighting them, though sadly Maltruant had the last laugh here as he'd gotten his chariot fixed and slowed down everything to almost a complete stop. Thinking he'd won, they were caught by surprise as the time cycles came flying at him and fired missiles that he'd managed to avoid. He'd gotten away as everything continued where it left off, and George put a set of axes attached to a chain into his gun before firing a kite into the sky as lightning struck it, and he'd blasted the axes which had gained enough speed to cut through the anchor of Vilgax's ship, and George says, "Thank you, Dr. Franklin," as Vilgax began to retreat, saying that whatever power that was that allowed that creature to transform into different species, he would have it. As they were leaving, Ben suggested changing the name from Plumier to Plumbers, calling him Mr. President, as he then got into his time cycle and he and Rook took off, which George confusedly asked, "President didn't? The two of them followed Maltruant as he'd hatched a second time beast and used it to make his way out of the time stream itself, back to whatever was before. Rook says that they should brace themselves as they go in after him. The time cycles had become partially damaged as bits were breaking off, but they'd made it through, finding themselves in an endless void. The two of them then ended up headed towards something in the void, seeing a Contumelia ship, and crashed into it. They break their way out of the damaged time cycles and finding their way to the bridge as Ben asked Rook if he was seeing the same thing that he was. Rook says that he was seeing three of his father. Ben shakes his head, saying that's not what he sees. The beings walk over to them and explain that their forms cannot be comprehended by them, so whatever they see is what holds the most sway over their heart. Rook says that he sees three of his father and asked what Ben saw. Ben responds that he sees the closest one to them as Gwen, with the other two being Max and Tetrak. The Contumelia closest to them says that is interesting as they have never encountered someone who had seen three different people or things before, as they say that they are about to create a universe, and Ben says that they gotta stop Maltruant who has an Annihilarg, and they say that that sounded interesting. The Contumelia then teleport Rook and Ben to where Maltruant had been, but he says that they are already too late, as an energy field appeared around his modified Annihilarg. The Contumelia say that the field protects them from everything going on, and it is impossible to breach. Ben tells them nothing is impossible. If you can't get through the field, go under, as he changed into Tomix and charged up energies into his fist as he began to beat his way into the floor, cracking it as he did so. One of the Contumelia says that this is rather interesting as they have found an alternate route to get to the device, watching with the Annihilarg beginning to glow and began dropping from the ship. Ben called out to Rook, who says that it was an honor to fight at Ben's side, as Ben says it's not over yet and charges up a massive blast all at once, blowing a hole straight through the ship's entire structure in both directions, cutting through both the top and bottom of the ship and every floor in between as he dove down trying to fly after the device. Ben timed out as the device began to go off, with him calling out that Gwen was going to kill him, as the energy blasted out with Cervantes cheering, claiming that he'd finally won, though that was short-lived as the energy began shrinking down and he demands to know what's going on, saying that the Contumelia are supposed to be observers only, not get involved. The energy then made its way back up the ship through the hole that Ben had blasted through it, stopping in front of them, with Maltruant asked what they were doing, and the Contumelia simply say that they are observing, as the energy shrank down further, showing feedback holding the energy as Rook calls out Ben's name. Ben begins cycling through his transformations like crazy. All of the transformations he'd had up until that point, so rapidly that some didn't even have time to form their full size, over and over again, with the energy shrinking down more and more in the process before stopping on feedback again, telling Maltruant that he wanted his very own Big Bang. Then have it. Ben then blasted him with the energy from their modified Annihilarg, blowing him to bits in the process. As Ben changed back to human after that and finding Maltruant's core, he decided it's time to end this once and for all, and hitting the Omnitrix, changing into Heat Blast. He then began cranking up the heat as he fired a non-stop stream of flame before kicking the core off the ship and blasting down at it again as it heated up again, getting redder and redder still, until finally it had been blown to pieces. The Contumelia then asked if they would like to watch the birth of their universe, as it would seem to be the most interesting one they have created yet, and Ben then changes back to human as he and Rook watch the universe being created, with Ben calling it incredible, and Rook agreeing with him. Once the universe had started, Paradox was able to show up, saying that this Ben really was unique, as the others had Maltruant in a time loop, but he simply finished the job outright. Truly puzzling and unique. He was looking forwards to seeing what comes next for them. We cut back to Ben and Rook and Mr. Smoothies finally able to relax for a bit after all that Time War stuff was finally over. Rook asked Ben if he was ready, and he nodded in response as they then went to get ready for what was to come next.